Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's victim story, I know it's annoying, but I need to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel here. I'm a new and small channel on YouTube, as you can see, and a simple click on the like button can help me a lot. So please subscribe to support me, click the like button and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Now, let's get to the case. Johnny Wells woke to the sharp screech of his old alarm clock, an unholy sound that cracked through the stillness of the early morning like a gunshot. The sun was barely visible on the horizon, and the air still carried the coolness of the night. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar creak of the old floorboards underfoot, grounding him in the routine of another day. His fingers found the edge of the nightstand, grabbing the half-empty coffee mug that had been sitting there since yesterday. He took a sip without much thought, black, as always. It was 4:30 a.m., the kind of time when the world outside was still. Sleeping, and for Johnny, it was the best time to be awake. The small coastal town of Durban, South Africa, was just beginning to stir with the soft hum of distant traffic and the cries of seagulls. But Johnny was already on his feet, heading for his boat. He pulled on his old worn fishing boots thick with the smell of salt water and fish guts. The boots had seen years of use, but there was no replacing them, not yet. The same could be said for the rest of him. His back ached from the years of hauling in nets, his hands were thick and calloused, each line on his face carved by time and the harsh elements. But it was this life he had chosen, and despite the toll it took on his body, he wouldn't trade it for anything else. Johnny had been a fisherman all his life. It was in his blood. His father had been a fisherman too, and his grandfather before him. The ocean was where Johnny felt most at home, the pull of the tides like a magnetic force. There was something about the rhythm of the sea, the way it whispered and roared, calmed and raged, that brought him peace. He respected it, feared it even, but he loved it in a way that made him forget about the aches and pains of growing old. He stepped outside, the air heavy with the scent of brine and the promise of a new day. The boat, an old wooden vessel that had seen better days, was already waiting for him at the dock. Johnny's eyes flickered over the lines of the boat, his hand instinctively reaching for the ropes. He untied them with practiced efficiency, the motions as familiar to him as breathing. Morning. Johnny! Luis, the owner of the fish market down the road, waved from his own boat, already out in the water and preparing to cast his nets. Johnny waved back, but there was no time for conversation. He had work to do. The fish weren't going to catch themselves. The engine of Johnny's boat rumbled to life with a sputter before settling into its usual steady hum. The waves lapped at the hull as he made his way out of the harbor, the familiar sights of the town receding behind him. The waters were calm this morning, a soft blue that blended with the pale sky. There wasn't a cloud in sight. It was the kind of day that made fishing feel almost like a meditation. He set his course for the area where the fish were usually abundant, a small, shallow reef just a few miles off the coast. The ride was smooth, and the boat seemed to glide over the water like a bird in flight. Johnny sat at the wheel, steering with ease, his mind already on the work ahead. By the time he reached the reef, the sun had started to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the water. The sea was still, the only sounds the gentle lapping of the waves and the occasional squawk of a gull overhead. Johnny lowered the anchor, the metal chain clinking as it hit the bottom of the ocean. He pulled on his gloves, his fingers slipping easily into the worn leather. It was time to get to work. The fish were waiting. Johnny had been cleaning fish for over 30 years, a task he could do in his sleep. He began with the biggest of the catch, a large grouper that had put up a decent fight. The blade of his knife sliced easily through the tough skin, the smell of fresh blood wafting up into the air. The scent of the blood hit the water almost immediately, and Johnny didn't think much of it. It was just part of the job. He hummed under his breath as he worked, his knife cutting through the fish with practiced precision. His mind wandered, drifting from one thought to the next. There was a certain rhythm to the task, cut, discard, repeat, and it brought him a kind of peace. In these quiet moments, he could forget about the world around him. The ocean was his to conquer, and the fish, though relentless, were his to catch. But today something felt different. Johnny couldn't quite place it at first. Maybe it was the way the birds had quieted, or the faint shift in the wind. The usual sounds of the sea seemed muffled, distant somehow, as if the ocean was holding its breath. He shook his head, dismissing the feeling. He was just being paranoid. There was nothing unusual here, nothing at all. The first hint of danger came in the form of a small ripple in the water just off the side of the boat. Johnny's eyes flickered toward it, but he didn't give it much thought. A fish? A wave? Who knew? But then it came again, this time larger, a disturbance that broke the surface of the water with a soft splashing sound. Johnny stood up straighter, narrowing his eyes. Something wasn't right. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the shape below the surface. It was large, far too large to be a school of fish. The water around it seemed darker, as if the ocean itself was deepening. It was then that the real fear set in. Johnny's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. A shark. He watched, frozen. As the shape drew closer, the water around the boat grew even darker, and Johnny felt a tight knot form in his stomach. He had heard stories, of course. Fishermen had been attacked before, right here in these waters. But it was always someone else, never him, never Johnny Wells. The shark circled beneath the boat, its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a blade. Johnny's heart hammered in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of his own panic. "What the hell is it doing?" The shark was getting closer now, and Johnny he just knew, that it wasn't here for the fish. It had been drawn in by the blood, the smell of it thick in the water. His hands shook as he grabbed the edge of the boat, his fingers slipping. And then, without warning, it struck. The force of the shark's impact was like nothing Johnny had ever felt before. It hit the side of the boat with a bone-crushing slam, the wood splintering under the pressure. Johnny stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart was in his throat, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to get away. But there was nowhere to go. The shark was in the water, its massive body moving with terrifying speed. Johnny could hear the sound of its powerful jaws snapping. Through the air, the water around him frothing with blood. And then, teeth. It was a blur of pain, an explosion of agony that seemed to come from nowhere. Johnny screamed as the shark clamped down on his leg, its teeth sinking deep into his flesh. The world went white with pain, and the only thing he could hear was the rush of blood in his ears. He kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. The shark wasn't letting go. In that moment, Johnny knew. He was fighting for his life. Johnny's eyes stayed locked on the water, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The shark's shadow moved beneath the boat like a ghost in the deep, its dark silhouette cutting through the water with a terrifying precision. Johnny's hands tightened on the edge of the boat, his knuckles turning white as the realization set in. This wasn't a random encounter. The predator had purpose in its movements. He swallowed hard, the salty air stinging his dry throat. His heart was beating in his chest like a drum, loud and fast, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to get out of the water. But the boat was anchored too firmly now. He couldn't just start the engine and drive away. "Come on, old girl," Johnny muttered to the boat under his breath, as if trying to coax it into starting up on its own. He glanced down at the motor, the rusted parts that had given him trouble in the past. But there was no time to think about that now. He needed to focus, to stay calm. The shark's fin broke the surface again, slicing through the water a few yards from the boat. Johnny froze, the sight sending a cold wave of fear down his spine. It was close, too close. A small part of his mind tried to reassure him. It was just circling. Sharks didn't attack unless they were provoked, right? This wasn't a great white, and this wasn't a feeding frenzy. Bull sharks were known to be aggressive, sure, but they usually kept to themselves. But Johnny knew better than to trust any shark. The ocean, after all, wasn't predictable. And this shark, had no reason to hold back. He gritted his teeth and stood up, stepping cautiously toward the side of the boat. The sound of the water splashing lightly against the hull seemed impossibly loud now, drowning out the rest of the world. It felt like the ocean itself was holding its breath. Everything seemed so quiet, too quiet, except for the pounding of his heart in his ears. Johnny tried to steady his hands. He reached into the toolbox that lay next to him, his fingers fumbling for the knife he always kept in case of trouble. It was a small rusty thing, Nothing like the blades used for big game fishing, but it might be enough to fight back if it came to that. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually used it, but now he was praying it would be enough. He glanced up again at the water, his pulse quickening. The shark was closer now, its enormous body slicing through the depths with eerie calmness. It circled once, then twice. The water around it began to grow darker, the blood from his morning catch staining the ocean red. He wasn't sure if it was the blood that had drawn it, or if it was simply the shark's natural instinct to hunt. Either way, Johnny could feel his throat tighten, a sense of panic clawing at his insides. He was alone, completely alone, in the middle of a vast ocean with no one around for miles. He had made the mistake of going out too far this morning, thinking the calm sea would offer him some peace, not realizing the danger lurking beneath the surface. The shark's tail swished beneath the water, and Johnny's stomach flipped. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The shark was watching him, waiting for an opening. It was like a game to it, a slow, methodical stalking, but Johnny knew better than to underestimate it. Sharks were apex predators for a reason. His breathing grew quicker, more erratic. He took a few steps back, his eyes never leaving the water. The boat swayed gently beneath his feet, as if it too sensed the tension in the air, then as if answering. His thoughts, the shark made its move. It was so fast. One moment, Johnny saw nothing but the ripples of the water. The next, the shark's enormous mouth was open wide, its rows of sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. It surged upward, breaking the surface with an explosive force that sent a spray of water over Johnny's head. "Jesus Christ!" Johnny shouted, stumbling back in shock. His heart raced in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what he had just witnessed. The shark circled again, this time much closer, its sleek body cutting through the water like a missile. Johnny's instincts kicked in, and he scrambled to his feet, knocking over his toolbox in the process. The knife fell onto the deck with a hollow clink, but Johnny didn't have time to reach for it. The shark's dorsal fin cut through the water again, coming closer, so close that Johnny could see the dark eyes watching him from beneath the surface. The creature was patient, unnervingly patient, as if it was sizing him up, determining when the right moment to strike would be. Johnny's pulse thundered in his ears, and his legs felt weak beneath him. He thought about Luis and the other fishermen, back at the harbor. They had to be out there somewhere, right? Someone would see his boat, someone would come for him. But the boat was still too far out. There were no other boats nearby, nothing but the vast, endless ocean and the sharp teeth of a predator waiting in the deep. Johnny gripped the side of the boat, trying to steady his breath. He needed to stay calm. Panicking would only make it worse. He had to think. The shark's fin reappeared, slicing through the water with terrifying ease. Johnny's mouth went dry, and his muscles tensed, ready to leap into action. It was now or never. He grabbed the small anchor line, his fingers working swiftly as he tied a loose knot to give the boat some maneuverability. His heart was pounding in his throat, but he forced himself to breathe through the panic. If he could just get the boat started, he might stand a chance. The shark couldn't keep up with the boat once it was moving. He had to get the engine going. Johnny turned toward the motor, hands shaking as he reached for the pull cord. He yanked it. Nothing. The motor sputtered and stalled. "No, no, no, no!" he hissed through gritted teeth, pulling harder this time, desperation creeping into his voice. He couldn't give up. Not now. The shark's fin broke the surface once more, and this time it was closer than ever. Johnny's blood ran cold as the water around him began to churn with terrifying force. His stomach twisted as the fear threatened to paralyze him. It was no longer just a question of getting the engine started. It was a fight for survival. With a final, desperate pull, the engine roared to life. The boat jerked forward, and Johnny didn't look back. His eyes were locked on the horizon as he gunned the motor, the boat cutting through the water at full speed, but the shark was still out there, somewhere beneath the surface, waiting. The boat rocked gently in the water, its creaking becoming a maddening rhythm that matched the pounding in Johnny's chest. His breath came fast and shallow, the air thick with the salty scent of the sea, but all he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears and the sound of the water lapping against the hull. It felt as though the ocean itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The shark had disappeared below the surface, But Johnny knew it wasn't gone. He knew it was still there, lurking just beneath the calm water, watching him, with those dark, unblinking eyes. He had been a fisherman long enough to understand the way sharks moved, the subtle shifts in the water when they were nearby. And now, there was no mistaking it. The predator was closing in. He gripped the edge of the boat tightly, his fingers digging into the weathered wood, the muscles in his arms burning as he fought to stay calm. Panic was not an option. The shark was waiting for a weakness, an opportunity to strike. Johnny couldn't. "Give it one. Come on," he muttered under his breath, the words barely audible above the sound of the waves. His hands were trembling, but he forced himself to focus. The engine. It was the only way out of this mess. If he could get the boat moving even just a little bit, he might have a chance. He couldn't let the shark get any closer. Johnny crouched beside the motor, reaching for the pull cord. His fingers brushed against the rough handle, but before he could grab it, a ripple of movement caught his eye just beneath the surface. The water around the boat seemed to shift unnaturally, the subtle waves turning into something more deliberate. And then, with terrifying speed, the shark exploded. Out of the water, its massive body breaching the surface like a bullet. Johnny barely had time to react. The creature's jaws snapped shut with a sickening wet crack, just inches from his leg. The force of the attack knocked the boat sideways, sending Johnny sprawling onto the deck with a gasp of shock. "Jesus!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. His heart raced as he looked down at the water, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shark hadn't made contact, but it was so close, so impossibly close. It was there. He could feel the heat of its breath, the primal force of its hunger. He backed away from the edge of the boat, eyes darting to the horizon. There was nothing. No other boats, no land in sight. Just the endless expanse of ocean stretching out. In every direction. His stomach churned. The shark circled again, its body moving smoothly through the water, sleek and lethal. It wasn't just an animal, it was a machine. Predator and prey in one, an ancient force of nature. Johnny could see the shape of it now, its long muscular body cutting through the water like a knife. Its dark, menacing eyes never left him. It knew what he was, knew that he was the prey. Not today, Johnny whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. He wasn't going to die here, not on this boat, not like this. He glanced quickly at the anchor line, but it wasn't going to help. It wouldn't be enough to break free, not with the engine still stalled and the shark circling like a hunter that smelled weakness. He had to think faster. He had to do something to get out of the water. His eyes locked on the small cooler in the back of the boat. It was a stupid, fleeting thought, but it might work. He'd used the cooler to keep his catch fresh during long trips before, and the shark was drawn to blood. He just needed a distraction, something to pull its attention, away long enough for him to make a move. The shark swam closer, its sleek body cutting through the water like a shadow. Johnny's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain still to keep his breath steady. His hand moved instinctively toward the cooler, and he pulled it open with a desperate motion. He grabbed a small fish from inside, a smaller one he'd caught earlier, and held it up over the side of the boat. The blood from the fish began to seep into the water, a small but potent signal to the shark. For a moment, nothing happened. The shark continued to circle, but it wasn't showing any signs of rushing toward the boat. Johnny's heart skipped a beat. Maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The shark had to be hungry. It was a predator, after all. Maybe the blood would draw it away. But then, with horrifying speed, the shark turned. Its eyes locked onto the fresh blood in the water, and in an instant it was there, its body surging forward with terrifying speed. Johnny barely had time to react. The shark's mouth opened wide, the rows of teeth gleaming in the morning light, and in the next instant, it launched itself from the water, aiming directly for Johnny's leg. The force of the attack sent the boat rocking wildly, its hull groaning in protest. Johnny screamed, instinctively lifting his foot to try and avoid the jaws, but it was too late. The shark's teeth sank deep into his calf. Johnny's scream of pain was cut off by the pressure of the creature's grip, its teeth grinding into flesh and bone. The shock of it, sharp, unrelenting, made his head spin. Blood poured into the water, turning it dark and murky, but it was nothing compared to the agony that radiated up from his leg. God, no! Johnny screamed, thrashing wildly. His free leg kicked out, desperate to make contact with the shark, but it was useless. The creature's grip was unyielding, its powerful jaws locked onto his flesh with terrifying force. He could feel the strength in the animal's bite, the crushing power of its jaws. The pain was unbearable, but Johnny fought back. He didn't know how he managed to do it, but with all the strength he had left, he kicked and shoved at the shark's face, his boot making contact with its snout. For a moment, it seemed like the shark hesitated, pulling back just enough for Johnny to tear his leg free. But even as he fought to keep his balance, the shark was already circling again, its body darting under the water with terrifying speed. It wasn't done. Not yet. Johnny's breath came in desperate gasps, the pain in his leg nearly overwhelming. He reached down to assess the wound, but he didn't need to see it to know that it was bad. His leg was bleeding heavily, the blood swirling in the water around him, and the shark would smell it from miles away. The water churned again, and Johnny barely had time to react before the shark came at him once more. This time, he wasn't as lucky. The shark lunged out of the water in one swift, powerful motion, and Johnny felt the teeth pierce his side, deep, jagged wounds that felt like they were tearing him apart. He screamed in pain, a guttural, hoarse sound that echoed across the water. The boat lurched under him, rocking violently as the shark continued to thrash, pulling at him with a ferocity that felt like it would tear him in two. Johnny knew he had only moments before he would lose consciousness. He had to fight. He had to survive. But his strength was fading, his vision growing dim. The blood, his blood mixed with the salt water, and for a moment all he could hear was the relentless sound of the waves and the deep, terrible growl of the shark as it disappeared back into the depths. Johnny's leg burned with searing pain, the blood flowing from the wound in thick, steady streams, turning the water around him a dark crimson. His heart hammered in his chest, a rhythmic drum of desperation. He could feel the weight of the shark's attack, the force of its grip even now as it circled beneath the boat. The taste of salt and iron filled his mouth, mixing with the sharp tang of fear. The shark hadn't gone. It was still out there, prowling in the deep blue, waiting for its next strike. Johnny had been lucky, if luck was even something you could count on in a situation like this. He had torn his leg free, but the predator's hunger had only grown sharper. He had to think. He had to move. The boat rocked again, this time with a harder jolt, as if the shark was testing its limits, pushing against the boat's hull, trying to feel the resistance of its prey. Johnny's head spun, dizzy with pain, but he fought to stay focused. His mind raced through all the things he knew, every bit of fishing lore, every scrap of advice he had ever gotten from the old men down at the harbor. Nothing seemed relevant. No, nothing seemed enough. He reached for his leg, gritting his teeth as his hand met the gaping wound. His fingers slid through the blood-soaked fabric of his pants, his mind screaming that this was all wrong. He needed to stop the bleeding. He needed to do something, but his thoughts were muddled by the sheer intensity of the pain. The wound was deep, too deep, and there was no way he could bandage it up out here, alone in the middle of the ocean. The thought of infection loomed in the back of his mind, but there was no time for that. Not yet. His breath was shallow, each inhale sending a new wave of agony through his leg. The shark swam beneath the boat again, and Johnny's stomach churned. It was circling, there was no question about it now. It had tasted blood, and it would not stop until it had claimed its prize. He could feel its presence, even in the stillness of the water. That deadly silence, that low murmur of the ocean, all betrayed the movement of a predator waiting for its next strike. "Think, damn it," Johnny muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse and raw. He didn't have much time. If he stayed here, stayed still, he'd bleed out. The shark would pick him off like a lamb to slaughter, but moving wasn't an option either. His leg was a mess, his body already beginning to feel weaker with each passing second. His head was swimming, vision blurring at the edges. The boat was all he had. The motor, if he could get it running, was his only escape. But first, he had to get away from the shark. The water around him rippled again, this time more violently, as the shark rose just below the surface, sending a wave of terror through Johnny's entire being. It was coming back. He could see its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife. There was no mistaking it now. It was on the attack, Johnny scrambled to his feet, every muscle in his body protesting as he forced himself to move. His legs screamed in protest, but there was no choice. He grabbed the side of the boat, using his upper body strength to haul himself up. He needed to get to the motor. He had to start the engine. The shark was faster than Johnny had anticipated. He barely had time to react when it surged toward the boat with terrifying speed, its gaping maw open wide, jaws snapping. Johnny's eyes went wide as he dove to the side, falling awkwardly onto the deck as the shark's teeth missed his body. By inches, the force of its strike rocking the boat again. His breath caught in his throat. He could feel the wind from the shark's lunge pass right over him, its enormous body slipping back into the water with a deadly swish. "Christ," Johnny whispered, his voice breaking. His heart was pounding so hard in his chest that it felt like his ribs might crack. His hands were slick with sweat and he couldn't stop shaking. His leg, the blood. He glanced down again, seeing the crimson stain spreading across the wood beneath him. There wasn't much time left. The pain in his leg was unbearable, and he could feel himself slipping in and out of consciousness. He needed to focus. He couldn't give in to panic. The shark was back below the surface now, swimming closer again, its movements smooth and calculated. Johnny could hear the low swish of the water as it passed beneath him. The fin appeared once more, cutting through the surface, this time even closer. The animal was biding its time, watching, waiting for its opportunity to strike. Johnny's fingers curled around the pull cord of the engine. His mind screamed at him to hurry, but every motion was slower than he wanted it to be. He was losing blood and fast. The wound on his leg burned like fire. With a trembling hand, Johnny yanked the cord. The engine sputtered to life, coughing and stuttering as the boat jerked forward. It was enough, barely enough. The boat lurched, its engines sputtering, but it moved. Johnny grabbed the throttle, cranking it as far as it would go, the boat picking up speed. His legs screamed in protest with every shift of his body, but he didn't have a choice. The water behind him churned violently as the shark turned, its body breaking through the surface in an explosive surge. The boat was moving, but the predator was faster. It was relentless. Johnny could hear the rush of water, feel the press of the shark's body against the hull as it circled again, testing its prey. "God help me!" Johnny gasped, his voice shaking, the engine whining in protest. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The shark came in again, its powerful tail creating waves that slapped against the sides of the boat, sending a violent spray of seawater into the air. Johnny swore under his breath. The boat was swaying now, rocking in the turbulent water. He was losing control. He glanced at the shoreline. He was too far out. His only hope was the Coast Guard, but there was no time to call them. His radio was in the storage compartment, buried under a pile of fishing gear. He didn't have the strength to get it now. With one last desperate effort, Johnny yanked the throttle forward again, feeling the boat surge ahead, faster now, carving through the water. The shark followed undeterred, its dark form cutting through the waves with terrifying precision. Johnny's thoughts became a blur of fear and adrenaline. He was running out of time, running out of strength, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let this be the end. The boat was moving faster, but it was the only thing keeping him alive now. The shark was still behind him, but the engine was working at full speed. The shore was still too far, but at least Johnny had a chance. Suddenly, there was a sound, a crack, followed by a violent shudder of the boat. The engine sputtered once more and then died completely. "No, no, no!" Johnny screamed, his body going cold with dread. The boat jerked to a stop, its engine giving up completely. The shark was closer than ever now, its dorsal fins slicing through the water just yards away. Johnny looked down at the motor in disbelief. It was dead, and the shark wasn't giving up. Johnny's hands gripped the throttle with the last of his strength, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep the boat moving forward. His leg was on fire, the blood soaking through his pants, dripping steadily into the water, leaving a trail behind him. Every time the boat hit a wave, the pain radiated through his body, threatening to knock him unconscious. But he couldn't afford to lose focus now. The shark was still there. It had followed him relentlessly, always just beneath the surface. Every time Johnny glanced over his shoulder, the dark, ominous silhouette of the predator loomed in the water, its dorsal fins slicing through the surface like a harbinger of death. Johnny's chest tightened with fear. his breath shallow and quick. He knew that the more blood he lost, the weaker he became, and the less time he had to escape. He had to keep going. He had to outrun it. But the ocean was vast, endless, and Johnny was alone. The boat's engine sputtered again, threatening to stall. He leaned into it harder, praying it would hold up just a little longer. His leg throbbed, the wound deep and jagged, and every time he moved, the pain was a sharp reminder of how much time he'd lost. His vision blurred at the edges, and a dizziness crept in, threatening to pull him under. He was losing blood faster than he could stop it, and the realization made his stomach churn. Come on, Johnny muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. He could see the coastline now, but it was still too far away, far too far for someone in his condition. The current was pushing him away from shore, and the shark was still closing in. Another jolt, another wave crashing against the boat. Johnny's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the water slapping against the hull with more force, and then the unmistakable sound of a massive splash. He didn't have to look. He knew what it was. The shark had breached. The boat rocked violently, sending Johnny tumbling sideways, his body slamming hard against the wooden side. His heart raced as he scrambled to right himself, his hands slick with blood and sweat. He turned toward the back of the boat, his mind screaming for him to keep moving. But then he saw it. The shark was there. It was a massive creature, its gaping mouth wide, rows of razor-sharp teeth gleaming as it surged toward him. Johnny's heart lurched in his chest, and in that moment time seemed to stretch, the seconds dragging by as the predator bore down on him. The boat shuddered again, this time with an even greater force, and Johnny was thrown back. His vision swam, and for a moment he thought he was falling into the water, but the hard edge of the boat's deck stopped him. He gasped, struggling to push himself up, his head spinning. His body was a mess of pain and exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The shark was coming. Not today, Johnny whispered through gritted teeth, forcing himself to his knees. He could hear the predator circling beneath the boat, its body shifting through the water with frightening precision. He couldn't think. He couldn't allow himself to think. He had to move. The boat lurched again, this time with a deafening crash. Johnny barely had time to react before the shark's body struck the hull, sending a tremor through the entire boat. Water poured over the sides as the boat rocked wildly. Johnny fell to the deck, his leg buckling beneath him, the pain almost too much to bear. His head throbbed, and his vision swirled, but he forced himself to look up. The shark had hit the boat with such force that a chunk of the hull had splintered. It was only a matter of time before the boat began to sink. Johnny's stomach twisted as he saw the water rushing in, the crack in the boat's side widening with each passing second. There was no way the boat could stay afloat much longer. He had to get out. With everything inside him, Johnny crawled toward the back of the boat, his leg dragging behind him, leaving a trail of blood. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps, the pain in his leg sharp enough to make him dizzy. He reached for the cooler, forcing himself to stay focused, to think. The cooler. He pulled it over, desperate to keep his mind occupied, desperate to find something that might help. The fish inside had long since spoiled, the blood in the water. An invitation for the shark. But in his panic, Johnny grabbed the first thing he could, an old tattered rope. He didn't know what he was thinking. It was a blind hope, a last-ditch effort to do something, anything, before the shark finished what it had started. The boat shuddered again as the shark rammed it once more, and Johnny felt the wood beneath him give way, a sickening creak that echoed in his ears. He looked over the side of the boat, where the shark had returned to its position below the surface. Its dark, unforgiving eyes were locked on him. His heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't fight it. The shark had no fear. It was a creature of instinct, and it wasn't leaving until it had what it came for. Johnny's breath caught in his throat as the water began to rise, inching up the sides of the boat. "Help! Help!" he cried, though he knew no one could hear him. There was no one around for miles, no other boats, no sign of life, just him and the relentless ocean. The shark's dorsal fin cut through the water once more, this time closer, right beneath the boat. Johnny's heart skipped a beat as he threw the rope over the side, hoping that the makeshift line would somehow, impossibly, keep him afloat. But the shark was on him. It was a blur of motion. One moment Johnny was pulling on the rope, trying to hold himself steady, and the next moment he was on the deck, screaming as the shark's massive body slammed into the boat again, this time cracking the side open. The water surged in faster than Johnny could react. "God, no," he yelled, his voice hoarse with fear and pain. The boat tilted violently, and Johnny felt himself falling again, this time with no way to brace himself. The shark lunged. Johnny barely had time to brace for impact before the beast was on him, its jaws snapping shut with terrifying force. Johnny screamed in pain as the sharp teeth bit into his shoulder, the pressure intense and crushing. He was dragged toward the side of the boat, his leg buckling beneath him. But somehow he managed to stay conscious, driven by pure survival instinct. With a strength born from desperation, Johnny twisted, managing to reach for the boat's edge and pull himself free from the shark's grip. His shoulder throbbed, the blood flowing freely now, but he didn't have time to think. The boat was sinking, the water pouring in faster than he could manage. Johnny gritted his teeth and climbed onto the side, trying to steady himself, but he could feel the boat tipping, leaning dangerously. The shark was still circling below, its dark shadow a constant presence. Johnny's body screamed for rest, but there was no time. There was never any time. As the boat continued to sink, Johnny realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that this was it. No one was coming for him. He was alone in the ocean, surrounded by the endless expanse of water. The shark waited, and the blood kept flowing. Then, just as it seemed all hope was lost, a faint sound reached Johnny's ears. Distant at first, then louder, the whine of a boat engine. A light on the horizon, a rescue, but the shark wasn't done yet. The final fight was about to begin. Johnny's world went white with pain. The shark's jaws closed around his leg with a sickening crunch, its teeth sinking deep into his flesh. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roaring water and the thunderous pounding of his heart. Every inch of his body felt as if it were on fire, the agony of the bite almost more than he could bear. The shark's powerful, unrelenting grip sent waves of terror crashing through him, its massive body thrashing beneath the water, pulling him closer. It was then that Johnny realized this was it. He was going to die. The blood was pouring out of him, staining the water crimson. His vision was already clouding with the darkness of unconsciousness, his mind slipping in and out of focus. His thoughts, scattered and desperate, screamed at him to fight, but there was nothing left to fight with. The pain was overwhelming, the world spinning and tilting as the shark yanked him under. For a moment, he was submerged, his body held in its icy grip as the predator dragged him down into the depths. The pressure was suffocating, his lungs burning for air. His arms flailed, instinctively reaching for the surface, but the shark's bite was like a vice, holding him there. The water around him darkened, the light fading from his surroundings, and the pressure on his leg intensified. His heart hammered in his chest, but all he could do was struggle in vain. He thought of his family, his friends back at the dock, the people he'd known all his life. He thought of the sunrises and sunsets he'd watched from the shore, the salty air and the sound of the waves. How could this be the end? How could this be where it all finished, down here beneath the surface of the ocean? The shark tightened its grip, and Johnny let out a strangled cry, his body jerking as the creature's teeth sank deeper. His leg was a mangled mess of blood and shredded muscle. His mind was reeling, but something inside him, something deep in his gut, snapped. He was going to survive. He had to survive. He couldn't just let go. Not yet. In that moment, a spark of clarity surged through the fog of his pain, and Johnny realized he still had one last chance. The knife, the small rusted blade he always carried with him for cleaning fish. It was strapped to his belt, just beneath his jacket. His fingers were numb from the cold, and his body was weak, but his hand found the hilt, trembling with effort. He gripped it tight and drew it free, his hands slick with blood. The shark's grip was vice-like, but Johnny wasn't finished yet. He twisted the knife in his hand, feeling the cold steel beneath his fingers as he reached down with everything he had left. His leg burned like fire, but he forced himself to ignore it. The pain in his leg had become a distant echo, a reminder of the fight he was in. With every ounce of strength he had, Johnny drove the knife into the shark's gills, just behind its head. The movement was clumsy, fueled more by desperation than Precision. The shark let out a deafening guttural hiss, its body bucking violently in the water. For a second, Johnny thought he had missed, but then the creature recoiled, pulling back with an animal's primal scream, its grip loosening around his leg. Johnny took a sharp breath. The water around him swirled in chaos, the blood from his leg mixing with the sea. He kicked out with his free leg, pushing himself away from the shark. His whole body was shaking with exhaustion, the knife still in his hand. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He couldn't afford to think about the fact that he was losing too much blood. He could feel the darkness threatening to take him, but he couldn't let go now. The shark circled beneath him, its movement slow but predatory. Johnny's heart raced as he turned to face it, the knife still gripped in his hand. His leg was a mangled mess, the pain too much to bear, but he could see the creature's eyes now, those cold, unfeeling eyes that seemed to lock onto his soul. It was testing him, waiting for him to slip. But Johnny wasn't ready to die. "Come." "Hon?" Johnny gasped, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper above the roar of the ocean. The shark moved in again, and Johnny raised the knife, his arms trembling, his vision fading in and out. He was starting to lose his grip on reality, starting to feel the effects of blood loss cloud his thoughts. But the knife was still in his hand. He focused on that. That was all he had left. With a sudden violent lunge, the shark surged toward him again. Johnny swung the knife down with everything he had, the blade catching the shark just above its eyes. The creature thrashed, its entire body writhing in pain as the water around them turned a deeper red. For a moment, Johnny thought he had done it. He thought the shark might finally retreat, but it wasn't done. It wasn't finished yet. The predator came at him again, faster. This time, its teeth flashing in the murky water as it snapped at him. Johnny managed to dodge its first attack, but his leg gave way beneath him. He tumbled into the water, the knife slipping from his hand as he fought to stay afloat. His head went under, and the sharp sting of salt water filled his lungs. Panic clawed at him. He was going under. He could feel himself sinking, the world growing darker. His arms flailed desperately, trying to push himself back up, but his body was failing him. The blood loss was too much. He couldn't keep fighting. Then, just as his vision blurred to black, a hand grabbed his arm. It was strong, a lifeline in the stormy sea. Johnny's breath caught in his throat as he was pulled upward, the waves crashing over him. The arm was steady, unyielding, and he didn't know if he was imagining it or if this was real, but he didn't care. He grabbed onto the hand, clinging to it with everything he had left. "Hang on," a voice shouted, strained but clear. Johnny couldn't place it, couldn't focus on it. He was too far gone, but the hand wouldn't let go. The man, Johnny, couldn't see his face, just the blurred silhouette of him through the water, pulled him towards something solid. A boat, another boat. Johnny's breath came in ragged gasps, his body feeling like it was made of stone. His hands clawed at the side of the vessel as he was hauled aboard, the cool deck beneath him almost too much to bear. "Johnny, you're alive, you're alive?" The voice was insistent, frantic, and Johnny turned his head, blinking against the light. Dave? Johnny croaked, barely able to form the word. The man above him was Dave, the local fisherman who lived 2 piers down. "Yeah, it's me. You're going to be okay. Just hold on, Johnny, hold on." Dave pulled Johnny up completely onto the boat, the motion sending a fresh wave of pain through his leg. But he didn't care. He didn't care about the pain anymore. He was alive. The shark was gone. Dave worked quickly, wrapping Johnny's leg in a makeshift tourniquet, his hands steady despite the chaos of the moment. Johnny barely registered the action. He couldn't focus on anything. The blackness was closing in again, his mind slipping from reality. "Help's on the way, buddy. Just stay with me, okay?" Dave's voice was firm, but Johnny could hear the tremor beneath it. Dave wasn't used to seeing someone like this, not like this. Johnny could barely nod. His chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths, his head spinning. He had been so close, too close. The boat surged forward, heading toward the distant shore, but all Johnny could do was cling to the hope that, for now, he had escaped the jaws of death. Johnny's vision swam in and out of focus as the hand tightened around his arm, pulling him upwards. His lungs burned for air, his body aching from every movement, but he couldn't stop himself from being dragged towards safety. Every breath he took felt like fire, but he sucked in the salt-heavy air as the man yanked him closer to the boat. A surge of relief flooded through Johnny's battered body when he finally felt the solid edge of the boat beneath his fingers. "Almost there. Hang on." The voice was rough, strained with urgency. Johnny barely heard it. His head was spinning, his body betraying him with every move. The waves crashed around them, the relentless sea threatening to pull him under again. He could barely process the hand gripping his wrist, could hardly focus on the voice, but instinctively he gripped the side of the boat, pulling himself upward with what little strength he had left. His leg burned like fire, the open wound still, gushing blood, but all he could think about was getting out of the water. With a final heave, Johnny felt his body lifted, dragged over the side of the boat. He collapsed on the deck, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The world around him was spinning, the boat rocking with the waves, and for a moment he couldn't tell if he was still in the water or if he was somewhere else entirely. "Stay with me, man." The voice came again, now much closer. Johnny turned his head, his blurry vision making it hard to focus on the man who had saved him. He could make out a tall figure, a broad-shouldered man in a fishing vest, his face sunburned and weathered by years at sea. His eyes were sharp, though, focused on Johnny with an intensity that cut through the fog in Johnny's mind. Who are you?" Johnny croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt raw, every word like sandpaper scraping against his vocal cords. "Doesn't matter right now, I'm just getting you to shore," the man said, his voice steady but thick with effort. "You're gonna be all right, just keep breathing, all right?" Johnny nodded weakly, unable to speak, his mouth dry as a desert. His mind was hazy, fading in and out of awareness. He could feel the blood soaking through his pants, could feel the cold bite of the air on his damp skin. The world felt like it was closing in on him, but the man wasn't letting go. The pressure of his grip was strong, and Johnny could feel the urgency in every movement the man made as he pulled him toward the center of the boat. "What happened to the shark?" Johnny managed to ask, his voice cracking as he fought to stay conscious. The man's jaw tightened at the mention of the predator. "It's gone, for now. But you're lucky. Very lucky." Johnny's eyes flitted over to the water, but the shark was nowhere to be seen. The sea stretched out in every direction, vast and endless. His heart pounded in his chest, the memory of the shark's attack fresh in his mind. The way the massive creature had lurked beneath the surface, its dark eyes locked on him, its jaws snapping closed around his leg. He could still feel the phantom ache, the terror that had gripped him in those first moments. It was all too real, too close. The man was already working quickly, moving around the boat with practiced ease. Johnny could hear him pulling out a first aid kit, the sound of equipment being rummaged through. "I'm going to get you patched up, all right?" the man said, his voice taking on a more professional tone now. "You just stay still, keep calm." Johnny didn't have the energy to argue. He didn't have the energy for anything. His whole body felt numb, his muscles like lead. Every time he moved, his legs screamed in protest, a sharp reminder that the damage was much worse than he had realized. His leg, torn open by the shark's bite, was a mangled mess. Blood continued to seep out, staining the deck and the man's hands as he worked swiftly. "Hold on," the man said again, his voice almost a whisper, as if trying to calm Johnny but also to steady himself. The boat rocked with the rhythm of the waves, making it harder to keep Johnny still. Johnny gritted his teeth, trying to focus on something, anything other than the pain. The man was working efficiently, wrapping his leg, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. His hands were steady, though there was a tension in his movements as if he was racing against time. Johnny could sense the man's urgency, but he couldn't quite figure out why. Was it the blood loss? Was it the risk of infection from the shark's saliva? Johnny didn't have the mental clarity to ask. His eyes drifted, and he fought to keep them open. The world around him was starting to blur again. "Keep your head up, buddy," the man said. His voice was louder now, more insistent. "Stay with me. You're not out of the woods yet." Johnny's eyelids felt heavy, like they were made of stone. He mumbled, but the words failed him, trailing off into a rasping cough. The pain in his leg was nearly unbearable now, and the cold of the ocean had seeped into his bones. The blood loss was too much. The darkness was coming, and he couldn't hold it back anymore. "No," the man snapped, his hands rough as he grabbed Johnny by the shoulder and shook him gently. "Don't go to sleep, not yet. You've got to stay awake. We're almost there, all right? We're almost to the shore." Johnny's vision faltered, but he could hear the man's words. Almost to the shore. The thought stirred something inside. Him, a flicker of hope. He wanted to believe it, wanted to fight, but his body was exhausted, worn down by pain and blood loss. His eyelids fluttered again. "I'm not going to let you die here, man," the man's voice said again, more fierce than before. "You hear me? I'm not losing you to that damn shark." Johnny's head rolled to the side, and he saw the shoreline in the distance, dark outlines of trees, the promise of safety. The waves were crashing against the shore, just a few hundred yards away. The boat's engine roared louder now, the sound cutting through the silence. The man was still at work, keeping Johnny's leg elevated, binding it tightly. He kept talking, his voice never wavering, trying to keep Johnny tethered to reality. "Just hang on, Johnny," the man said. "We're almost there. Just hang on." Johnny's fingers twitched, his grip weak on the edge of the boat, but he felt it. Something in his gut, some primal will to live that refused to be extinguished. He wasn't ready to die. Not yet. The shore was in sight, the boat still moving, and he had to make it. He had to. Johnny's body felt like it was made of stone. Every breath he took was an effort, his chest aching with the effort to stay awake. The waves rocked the boat beneath him, and the cold of the ocean seemed to seep deeper into his bones. His leg, now wrapped tightly in makeshift bandages, pulsed with pain, and every time he shifted, the wound seemed to tear open further. But it wasn't the pain that made his mind spin. It was the exhaustion, the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. The man's voice, a steady anchor in the storm of his thoughts, broke through the haze again. "We're almost there, Johnny. Just hold on a little longer. We'll get you to the dock and get you help. You're going to be okay." Johnny tried to nod, but his head was heavy, too heavy. His eyes were barely open, and all he could do was focus on the sound of the engine, the rhythmic churning of the boat's motor as they cut through the water. His fingers twitched, a weak response, but it was all he could manage. The ocean stretched. Out before him, a vast expanse of dark blue, the horizon blurred by the setting sun. "Johnny," the man's voice was more insistent now, "stay with me. Don't pass out, you hear me?" The words were like a slap to his face. Johnny fought to keep his eyes open, but it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him, dragging him under. He had no idea how long it had been since the attack. Minutes? Hours? Time had become a fluid thing in the sea, stretching and warping with the tide. The pain in his leg was constant, a reminder of the brutal force of the shark's bite. But the constant pressure on his chest, the difficulty of keeping his mind from slipping into unconsciousness, was worse. "Come on, buddy. Look at me." The man was still there, his voice low but firm, trying to keep Johnny grounded. "We're almost at the dock. I'm not letting you slip away." Johnny felt a brief surge of adrenaline at the mention of the dock. He had to hold on. He couldn't die here in the middle of the ocean with no one around. He had a family, a life back on shore. He had so many things left to do. He tried to speak, to reassure the man, but his voice was lost in a rasping breath. His throat felt like it was on fire, and the words wouldn't come. His mind kept flickering in and out of clarity, each moment slipping further away from him. But he was still there, hanging on to that single thread of awareness. The man, clearly sensing his struggle, didn't let up. "Keep breathing, Johnny, just keep breathing." He kept a hand on Johnny's shoulder, steadying him as the boat surged forward. The shore was closer now, the outline of the dock becoming sharper with every passing moment. Johnny's thoughts scattered, but for some reason, the sound of the man's voice, calm and unwavering, seemed to anchor him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder that he was still alive. Despite the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision, despite the overwhelming pain in his leg, there was still a part of him that clung to life. The man's hand tightened on Johnny's shoulder, almost as if trying to keep him tethered to reality. "We're not far now, you hear that? Not far, you're gonna make it. You just have to hold on a little longer, just a little longer." Johnny's chest heaved with every breath, but the promise of land was enough to stir something deep inside him. He focused on the shore, on the trees and the faint outline of buildings. It was a lifeline. He just had to make it. He had to. A sharp pain shot through his leg, and Johnny gasped, his body jerking in response. He barely registered the man's voice calling his name again. "Johnny? Johnny, you're with me?" The pain was unbearable. His head swam with dizziness, his limbs heavy. He couldn't think. His vision darkened again, and he fought against it with every ounce of strength. He had left, but then the sound of the boat's motor changed. The hum of the engine grew louder, faster. The boat was pulling closer to shore. "Hold on, Johnny, we're almost there." Johnny's eyes fluttered open one last time, and he saw the dock ahead, the lights of the small harbor glinting in the dimming light. The figures of people were gathered at the end of the dock, shadows, moving quickly. He felt a spark of hope, a desperate surge of energy, but it was fleeting. The blackness was creeping in, threatening to swallow him whole. His head fell back against the deck, and for a moment he thought he might finally be slipping away. But then the boat jolted to a stop, the harsh scraping of the hull against the dock bringing him back. The sound of footsteps on the wood, the rush of voices, the commotion pulled him from the brink of unconsciousness. "Help!" The man's voice was frantic now, a sense of panic creeping in. "I need help. We've got a man down here. He's lost a lot of blood." Johnny felt hands grab him, lifting him, pulling him upright. The pain in his leg flared again, and he let out a strangled cry, but the hands were gentle, careful. They moved him with practiced ease, the voices around him a blur of urgency. "Take it easy, sir," one of the voices said. "We've got... You just stay with us, all right?" The cool night air hit Johnny's face, and the smell of salt and wood overwhelmed him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was on solid ground. The dock creaked beneath his feet as they moved him quickly toward a waiting vehicle. "Keep your eyes open, Johnny," the man's voice said, now more distant. "You're going to be all right. You just need to stay with us. We're almost there." Johnny wanted to speak, wanted to thank the man, but his voice failed him. He couldn't say anything. The pain was all-encompassing now, and his leg felt like it was on fire. The world was spinning again, and it felt like he was falling into darkness. He heard the whir of the vehicle's engine as they loaded him into the back. The rough bumps of the road jostled his body, and Johnny's breath hitched with each movement. It was hard to think, hard to process anything. His mind was slipping, and the blackness was closing in. But then he felt it again, warm hands, someone, calling his name, pulling him back. "Johnny, stay with us. We're almost there. Just stay with us." The words faded as his consciousness slipped once more, but he could still feel the pull of the voices, still feel the pressure of the hands on his shoulder, steadying him, guiding him through the pain, through the fog. And for a brief moment, just as the darkness threatened to swallow him completely, Johnny held onto the one thing that mattered most, the knowledge that he was alive. The sterile scent of antiseptic hit Johnny's nostrils as he slowly regained consciousness. The sharp metallic tang of medical supplies mixed with the faint salty undertone of the ocean that still clung to his skin. His mind was foggy, like he was floating in a haze, disconnected from his body. He felt the pulse in his leg, a deep, dull throb that seemed to echo through the rest of him. But he couldn't focus on it, not yet. His body was heavy, too heavy to move, and every time he tried to open his eyes, they felt as if they were glued shut. "Johnny, Johnny, are you with me?" The voice cut through the fog. It was familiar, rough but soothing in its urgency. He blinked slowly, forcing his eyes open. The light was harsh, bright overhead, and he squinted against it. His vision swam, but through the blur. He saw the face of the man, the one who had pulled him from the water. His face was lined with worry, his brow furrowed in concern, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes that made Johnny feel like he wasn't alone. "Where am I?" Johnny croaked, his throat dry like he hadn't had a drink of water in days. "You're in the hospital," the man said, his voice low and steady. But Johnny could hear the underlying tension. "You're safe. You're in Durban, in a clinic. They're taking care of you. Durban." The name rang a bell in Johnny's mind, but it was muffled, distant. His heart thudded heavily in his chest as he tried to make sense of the words. The last thing he remembered, he shuddered, was the shark, its massive, powerful jaws sinking into his leg, the rush of blood in the water, the cold, dark abyss. The terror. He squeezed his eyes shut again, trying to shut out the memories. "Easy," the man said, his hand resting gently on Johnny's shoulder. "I'm here. You're safe." Johnny's eyes fluttered open again, though it took every ounce of willpower to do so. The bright lights of the room seemed to sharpen, the sterile white walls closing in on him, and for a moment he was disoriented, unsure where he was. He shifted slightly, and pain shot up his leg like a lightning bolt. His breath caught, a gasp escaping his lips. "Take it easy," the man said, more firmly this time. "You're going to feel sore. The doctors fixed you up as best they could, but that leg's going to take a while to heal." Johnny turned his head toward the sound of the voice, trying to get a better look at his rescuer. He still couldn't remember his name. Hell, he couldn't remember much beyond the attack. But the man's face was clear now. The dark hair, streaked with gray at the temples, the weathered skin of someone who'd spent too many years working at sea. I didn't die," Johnny asked weakly, almost as if the question had to be asked aloud for him to believe it. The man smiled, but it was tight, strained. "No, you didn't die. You almost did, though. That shark didn't give up easily." Johnny swallowed, trying to find his voice. "The shark, I remember it coming at me. Its eyes. Those eyes." His voice faltered, the terror rising again like bile in his throat. The memory of the cold, calculating predator still haunted him. "Yeah," the man said, his voice softer now. "It wasn't just any shark, it was a bull shark. They're mean bastards. You're lucky it didn't finish what it started." Johnny turned his head away from the man, staring blankly at the ceiling. He could still hear the sound of the shark's teeth closing around his flesh, the rush of water, the pain. His leg. He looked down at the bandages that wrapped his lower limb, thick with bloodstains. The memory made him sick, his stomach churning. "I'm sorry," Johnny muttered, his voice shaking. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life." The man shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing what any decent person would do. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for the team at the clinic, though. They worked quickly. It's a miracle, really." "Miracle?" Johnny laughed hoarsely, but it sounded more like a gasp. "A shark bites my leg off, and you're telling me it's a miracle I'm alive?" The man gave a half smile, his eyes softening as he sat down on the edge of the bed. "Yeah, in a way it is. A lot of people don't make it out of that kind of situation, especially when they're alone in the water like you were. You don't get to walk away from a bull shark attack that easily." Johnny closed his eyes, but the memory of the attack flooded back, unbidden, overwhelming. He could hear the splash of water as the shark circled beneath him, the sensation of its teeth sinking into his flesh, the violence of the tug. His breath quickened, and the pain in his leg seemed to flare again as if the injury was still fresh. "Hey," the man said, his voice firm but gentle. "Take it slow. You're safe now. The doctors said it's a clean bite. Well, as clean as a shark bite can be. And you're going to make it. Just focus on resting, all right?" Johnny nodded, though his thoughts were scattered. His mind was a battlefield, the memories of the attack warring with the reality of the hospital room. The pounding pain in his leg, the feeling of the sharks, teeth, the cold, the blood. It was all too much to process at once. His head felt like it was going to split open. "I'm scared," Johnny admitted, his voice small, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. "I don't know what to do with all this. It's like I'm not me anymore, like I'm not the man I was before." The man was quiet for a long time. Johnny could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air, like an unspoken understanding. The sea had a way of changing people. The danger, the unpredictability. It left scars that no amount of time could erase. It wasn't just physical wounds that lasted. It was the psychological damage, the fear, the trauma, the knowing that death was never too far away. "Listen," the man said after a while, his voice softer now. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy. It won't be. Hell, it might never be. But I'll tell you this, you're here, you're alive, and that counts for something. It doesn't matter what happened before or what happens after. All that matters is right now, and right now, you're gonna heal." Johnny closed his eyes again, the weight of the words settling over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had escaped something far worse than the physical trauma of the attack. There was something else, something deeper, something he hadn't been able to confront yet. But the man's presence, his quiet understanding, was a small comfort in the midst of everything. "How long?" Johnny began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to get the words out. "How long until I can walk again?" The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're looking at a few months of recovery, maybe longer. It's going to take time to get that leg back to where it needs to be. And that's if the infection stays away. You're on antibiotics now, but there's always a risk. Johnny nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the man's words. A few months of recovery. A few months of therapy. A few months of learning how to walk again. It sounded like a lifetime. What if I can't do it? What if I can't get back out there? Johnny's voice was strained, filled with the quiet desperation of a man who had known nothing but the sea for most of his life. The man's face softened, his gaze steady. You'll get there. One step at a time, all right? It's not about getting back out to sea right away. It's about getting back to yourself. Johnny couldn't speak. He just nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He wasn't sure if he believed it yet, but there was something in the man's voice that made him want to try. For the first time since the attack, Johnny closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of peace, a fragile hope flickering deep inside him. The days after the attack blurred together. Johnny spent them in a haze of painkillers, quiet moments in his hospital bed, and the occasional bursts of memories that would slip through the fog of his mind. The leg, still wrapped in bandages and under the careful watch of the doctors, was his constant reminder of the nightmare he'd survived. But the real battle wasn't physical. It was the terror gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, the shark, the water, the blood. He tried to focus on the simple things, like the sun rising through the small window in his room, the sound of voices outside the door, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the nearby hospital cafe. Anything to drown out the haunting. Images that kept replaying in his head. But each time he closed his eyes, there it was. The predator's eyes, cold and merciless, the sharp teeth, the thrashing of the water. His own blood mixing with the ocean's salt. "You're doing good," the doctor had told him the day before, a reassuring smile on her face as she checked his bandages. "Your wound's healing faster than we expected. A couple more days, and we'll get you walking again." But Johnny wasn't sure if he'd ever walk again, not just physically, emotionally too. The thought of stepping outside, even feeling the salt on his skin, made his chest tighten. The ocean was no longer a place of comfort. It was a place of terror, a reminder that life was fragile, and he was one wrong move away from losing everything. He sat up in his bed now, the harsh white lights of the room flickering above him, and let out a breath. His leg burned with every small movement. His body was sore, stiff. The wounds had been cleaned, stitched up, but the emotional scars, those were still raw. The man, the one who'd saved him, had come by each day, offering small talk, keeping Johnny grounded in reality. His presence was a lifeline, the only thing that seemed to keep Johnny tethered to the world around him. "How you doing today?" the man asked, his voice gentle as he stepped into the room. His usual weathered, worn look was softened by the concern that was evident in his eyes. Johnny looked up at him, offering a small, tired smile. "Same as before," Johnny muttered. He glanced down at his leg, his hand subconsciously moving to touch the sheets around it. "It's hard to tell, you know. One minute I'm good. The next, it's like the whole thing is happening again every time I close my eyes." The man nodded, sitting on the chair beside Johnny's bed. "It's not easy," he said quietly. "It's not just the wound that takes time to heal. What happened to you, what you went through, it's going to take more than just some stitches. It's going to take time, but I'll tell you this. You're here. That means you're strong. You fought that damn shark, and you won." Johnny let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I don't feel like I won. It feels like I'm losing pieces of myself every day." "Yeah," the man said, his voice thoughtful. "I get that. But you know what? You're not the first person to survive something like this. It's a goddamn miracle that you're still breathing. And if you're still breathing, then you've got a chance. It's about what you do next. You make a choice. Every day. Do you let this define you, or do you keep going? Do you let it tear you down, or do you build yourself back up?" Johnny shifted uncomfortably in the bed. The man's words were sharp, hitting places Johnny wasn't ready to visit. But the words echoed in his mind, reverberating, even though he didn't want them to. He felt like he was standing at the edge of something deep, dark, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to jump or if he wanted to turn back. "I'm not sure I'm ready to build myself back up," Johnny said, softly, the vulnerability seeping through. "I don't know how to go back out there to face the water again. What if the next time I go out it's worse? What if I can't survive again?" The man exhaled slowly, the weight of Johnny's words settling between them. What happened to you wasn't a matter of luck. It wasn't some kind of sign. It was a shark, a predator. It does what it does. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but don't let that control you. Don't let fear decide your life. Johnny shifted his gaze to the window. Outside, the world was moving. People walking by, going about their lives. They didn't know what he'd been through. They didn't know the horror that lurked in the ocean. "I don't think I can go back out there, man," Johnny muttered, his voice barely audible. I can't even look at the water anymore without seeing that damn shark coming at me." The man sat in silence for a moment, as though weighing his next words carefully. "You don't have to go back out there today," he said finally, his tone steady. "But you can't let that shark win. It's not just the water, Johnny. It's everything. It's the fear that tries to stop you from living. And if you let that fear keep you from living, then the shark has already won. You can't let it take everything from you." Johnny closed his eyes, the man's words heavy on his chest. The weight of the past week, the trauma of the attack, the recovery, the pain, seemed to close in around him. He felt trapped in his own skin, like a part of him was missing, a part that had been ripped away in that violent encounter with the shark. But something in the man's words made him stop, made him question if maybe, just maybe, he could fight back, not just against the shark, but against the fear that had taken hold of him. He exhaled slowly, trying to clear the dark thoughts from his mind. "I don't know if I'm ready," Johnny admitted. "I don't think I'll ever be ready. But I don't want to be afraid anymore." The man nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "That's a start, Johnny. That's all you need. A start." The rest of the day passed slowly, the minutes stretching into hours. Johnny lay there, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He thought about the man's words, about the ocean that had once been his life. He thought about the shark and what it had taken from him, not just his body, but his sense of peace, his connection to the sea. But as the evening came, with the yow, sky tinged orange and the air carrying the scent of salt, Johnny felt a shift within him. It wasn't much, just a small glimmer of something that had been buried beneath the fear, but it was enough. He had a choice to make. He could let the shark win, let it control him, or he could face his fear and rebuild. For the first time since the attack, Johnny allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could face the ocean again. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. And when that day came, he would stand tall. The man's voice interrupted his thoughts once again. "How about tomorrow? You think you'll be ready to take a step outside, get some fresh air?" Johnny looked at him, the corners of his mouth lifting in a weak, hesitant smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough but stronger than before. "Yeah, maybe tomorrow." And for the first time in days, Johnny allowed himself to believe that he could heal.